Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, which is in conjunction with Archdesk, and we're looking at what on earth does the golden thread actually mean for you. And before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to introduce you to our platform here today, because we are going to ask you to get involved and ask questions. So firstly, if you want to ask questions, on the screen you can see you can type in your questions into the question box, and I can put those to our speakers at the end of the webinar. But we also have an ability for you to talk directly to us as well. So if you want to do that, raise your hand and I'll come to you at the end, and we can kind of get you on your microphone speaking to our speakers. So bear that in mind. Looking forward to lots of questions. And also we've got quite a few polls in this webinar. So Richard and Paul really want to hear your feedback and have got questions for you. So please, be aware that they're coming up, and we'll try and do them as quickly as we can, so we keep the flow going of this webinar. But they should provide some good conversational pieces as well. So on to today's webinar, and I think, I'm looking forward to hearing about the importance of golden thread and what it means to people. And really, we've got great speakers today that are going to offer advice about best practice, how to handle the huge amounts of data that are now needed to be done, the construction playbook and value procurement, and how that interacts with digitalisation, and the amount of information you now need to look at in terms of supply chain, locality, and even up to well-being as well. So lots to sort of consider. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. So Richard Scott joins us. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Nathan. Great to be here.
Good stuff. Good to see you. So Richard is a construction technology veteran who developed the first market construction PM tool, Priority One, known as FieldView. He's a mental health advocate for the industry and speaks openly about some of those topics, which hopefully we'll come on to. And Paul, hi Paul, how are you?
Morning everybody, I'm well.
So Paul Wilkinson is an authority on the use of construction collaboration technology platforms, SaaS platforms, and related fields such as BIM, mobile technologies, and social media. So great to have all your expertise on this webinar. Really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about the golden thread, and looking forward to some questions as well. So I'm going to hand over to you guys. I'm going to sit in the background and come back for the questions at the end, if that's okay.
Great, thanks Nathan. Yeah, this, just for everybody's guidance, apart from the polls, we're not going to be running with slides. This is very much a conversation, and it's a conversation in which we want to involve you. So, as Nathan said, ask questions, and if need be, if we can, we'll hopefully be able to let you ask those questions yourselves when we get to that in about sort of 40 minutes or so. Richard and I have known each other for rather longer than we sometimes care to remember, and through several different company manifestations. So I have worked across the industry for about 30 years, working in the IT sector for the last 20 years plus. And it was through those industry connections, particularly on the IT side, that I got to know Richard quite well. I write a blog about construction technology. I'm involved with the UK BIM Alliance and a thing called the Government and Industry Interoperability Group, amongst other things. So all of these areas have a bearing on what we'll be talking about today. And I'm pleased also that Nathan mentioned the construction playbook. Many of you might have seen notices this week that the construction playbook has just been updated. So version 1.1 came out, I think it was on Monday afternoon. And if you read the preamble to that document, you'll see that building safety is a cross-cutting theme for the playbook, alongside health, safety and well-being, and building smart and sustainably. So these are the themes, particularly on building safety, we'll be talking about today. But I think before we get into the conversation, we're very keen to understand your perspectives, where you're coming from. So Nathan, if we could have the first poll up, please. This is an opportunity for us to find out who is in our audience today, so that we can perhaps tailor our remarks to the fields within which you work.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that as well. Paul's introduction there, the golden thread is really going to require us to work in a far more collaborative, interconnected way, and a lot of project parties are going to be involved in that collaboration. And again, this is really just to help us understand, what part of the build life cycle are you involved in.
It's interesting the options don't include technology provider.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we could be included as a kind of subcontractor in this process, provider of technology to nearly all those other parties involved in a project. But perhaps as we are facilitators or enablers, it's a slightly different role to the traditional construction roles.
Yeah, and another point I'd add to that, which is quite interesting, Paul, is that there's no prescribed solution in any of the the research that I've taken as part of the preparation for this talk. No prescribed solution in terms of technology, but there are very specific references to the parties concerned and the role that they play. So I guess the list of project parties that we've got here is really about refers to references within the sort of the golden thread and the safety bill. So I guess these are the people who are at the coalface, if you like.
So I just let you know we've got nearly 80% of people voted. So maybe we'll give it a couple of seconds even, and I can publish that for you now. So bear with me. Hopefully you can see it on your screen now.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
okay.
So about 2/3 of our group are subcontractors or main contractors. Another third are architects.
Very interesting that the owner operator is very, very low, and ultimately golden thread is really about the owner operator, right? That's quite interesting. That's really quite interesting, I think.
It's probably a kind of a sign where many industry conversations take place within the supply chain. Often, it's I think at industry events, it's sometimes a struggle to get owner operators and even occupants of buildings along to trade shows because it's not usually core to their business. Buildings or other facilities are an aspect of how they deliver accommodation or offices or healthcare or education, but they don't regard themselves as constructors. So often difficult to get them to a construction webinar or to a construction event unless there's something specifically for them as owner operators.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a really interesting point. That's interesting. Okay. Well, I think shall we kick on, Paul? Shall we start?
Yeah, I was going to ask basically the background to a lot of the current debate around the we've already had the Building Safety Act enacted, but there is legislation pending. But the gestation of all of this was, of course, the Grenfell disaster. Tragically, many people lost their lives in the building in West London, and this prompted a wholesale review of regulations and legislation relating particularly to high-rise buildings. Richard, really it might be useful just to kind of highlight some of the issues around the construction and materials that were implicated in the Grenfell disaster and where we're going with the golden thread.
Yeah, sure. Well, it was an absolute tragedy that we all saw unfold on TV, right? And it was the catalyst for a huge amount of attention with regards to building safety. And what exactly happened there? It's really interesting to look back at it, because it highlighted that owners and asset owners, have very limited information about the makeup of the building that they own, and when I talk about the makeup, I talk about the materials, the components, the specifications, the attributes, the design, in terms of how it relates to safety. And of course, there was a a significant investigation after that terrible event, and something very specific was identified. And I think the specific is important because it was to do with the cladding, as I think most people know, and it was specifically related to polyethane-filled aluminium composite panels, right? Which caused a significant acceleration of the fire in that particular building. And the reason why I'm being very specific about this, in terms of the term of this component and the material and the specification, is this is really the level of detail that we are now having to deal with and having to talk about. And it left asset owners across the country, housing associations, asset owners, of high-rise residential specifically, but also care homes and hospitals as well, asking themselves the question, well, how does this impact me? All right, what kind of risk are we exposed to at the moment? And I sat in a meeting at the beginning of the year, and I was talking to somebody who's involved at quite a senior level in the housing association, and he said that we literally had no idea. All right, we had no idea whether these specific materials were within our portfolios, and that's just incredible, isn't it? Don't you just think that's incredible that we get to that situation? There was very little digital evidence, very little digital record keeping, in relation to the materials, the procurement, the supply chain, the installation and the commissioning, all very, very poor. And in some instances, these organizations had no choice. It was the only thing that they could do was to go out and physically inspect these buildings, sometimes drilling holes into the sides of cladding to take samples that were then going to be tested. And that's just not good enough, right? And I think that everybody realized, I think it was a wake-up call, that we need to understand what's contained in these assets, because they are important to people. If you think about how often in other aspects of your life do you accept something without considering what it's made up of or what's within it? There's this understanding of, okay, tell me, the characteristics of my car or my vehicle or the food that I eat or, or the clothes that I wear or there's a requirement to understand the detail and to understand, the choices that have been made in terms of producing and delivering that particular building. And we just didn't have this information. So that's really where it came from. This was the why. This is what drove this kind of golden thread initiative. And I think it's really then interesting to sort of talk about, what has been asked, in terms of the big picture.
Dame Judith Hackett, in her report, which was the first major official response to the disaster, made a detailed series of recommendations, and the phrase golden thread rapidly surfaced as probably the key concept about maintaining a persistent, long-lasting record of how a building has been designed, how it's been constructed, and how it's been maintained, so that occupants feel secure in their homes. And we also bring about a much needed, from many people's perspective, a much needed cultural change in the industry when it comes to managing information. As you say, Richard, we're often reliant upon paper-based records rather than digital records. That's the nature of our industry, which has been for many, many years heavily dependent upon paper. Pre-digital in many cases. Some of our buildings date back to the 1960s, 70s, before we were even working in a digital way to deliver those structures. But the key thing now is, with new technology, we can create a single source of truth, a consistent record that's developed and then maintained by responsible individuals, and also start to move away from that paper-based orientation, in particular, towards thinking about how that information will need to be accessed throughout its working life. And that, for me, is one of the important things about the golden thread, that it's about ensuring it remains shareable for the duration of the built asset, that the information is interoperable. It can exist independently of the technology that was used to create it. I mean,
Absolutely.
that is an
Absolutely.
important dimension for me. But
Yeah.
maybe we should drill into a little bit about the detail about how the golden thread has initially been implemented, particularly in respect of high-rise residential buildings, Richard.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to bear in mind that this is, an incredibly important, very critical initiative, but it's new. So there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of evolution. There are people trying to understand what this means. All of the tier one contractors are laser sharp focus on this particular initiative and understanding what it means. And I think, it's not as if this is something completely new in terms of its concept. If you look at manufacturing and automotive and so on, they've had essentially this concept of golden thread, in operation for many decades. So I think there's a lot of reason for us to look at, other industries as part of this. But in terms of what we're asking for, it's really about understanding the materials and the components and the specification and attributes of those materials and components that have been used inside of a building. Understanding the design aspects in terms of do they satisfy the safety requirement, but it's not just about the static aspects, right? It's not just about materials and attributes and specifications and part numbers and so on. It's also about how those materials have come together, what resources have been used to install them and to commission them, whether those resources and those companies responsible are adequately qualified and certified in order to be able to deliver the safe installation of those particular materials. So, this idea of golden thread sort of covering the entire life cycle is exactly that. It starts at design, it moves through procurement, it asks questions about when you're procuring this material. It's not just about price anymore. It's about the ability to deliver materials, components, data, and the necessary materials and resources, to support, your level of compliance. It's about encouraging transparency, as you say. During the construction of a building, it moves through many phases. It starts with concept and planning, moves to design, and then ultimately we get into pre-construction and construction, and we get to handover and operation. And the idea that this information flows through all of those processes and has very real value at each of those stages. So information is essentially being handed over, if you like, to other responsible parties who are going to need to add more to that particular set of information. So there's a lot of focus on interoperability. We've spoken a lot about this, in the last few weeks. We've spoke about sort of independent sort of software systems that are great at doing a very specific job, but aren't really designed to connect and interact with each other. And I think that, the golden thread is going to require, far more interoperability and the creation, if you like, of more of a sort of an ecosystem of information. And this also applies, and this is really important as well. You touched on earlier on. We speak specifically about new build, planning, design, pre-construction, construction, and so on. But the golden thread also applies to legacy buildings. So existing asset owners have the same level of responsibility to ensure that the building is safe, and not just safe from the perspective of how it was designed, safe from the perspective of how is that building today. So that building could be 20 or 30 years old. It could have gone through a lot of retro refits. It could have had extensions, added to it and so on. So it's not about the design says this building is safe. For legacy buildings, it's a case of the current status of this building. So there's a huge amount of work for legacy owner operators to do, as well as for new builds as well. And you mentioned just a second ago, and this is really important, I think, the bill specifically talks about digital only records. So it's no longer acceptable to have paper. It has to be digital, and they talk in terms of single source of the truth, terms that we've used a lot over the last few decades in construction. So this digital only approach is essential, and I think I'd raise that as a key topic here. Everybody has to be prepared to be able to deliver this evidence and compliance and operate around these principles of golden thread and transparency and providence, data providence in a digital way. And I think it's a good point that maybe to ask the next poll question. Paul.
Yeah, Nathan, we have a question about how information is going to be captured and about organisations' current levels of digitalisation. So if audience can please tick the item that is most applicable to them and their organisations, that'd be very helpful. I mean, one of the things that the construction playbook talks about is creating better whole life outcomes. That the phrase whole life features 32 times in the construction playbook. So what we're trying to do as part of the culture change around the golden thread is switch away from a kind of mentality which is just focused on design, construction through to handover, and get organizations, not just the owner operators, thinking about the whole life of the assets and thinking about their obligations to support the whole life, whether that's information from the early stages of specification right through to those who might be engaged in maintenance and upkeep of the building. So that a bit like the full service history of a car, it's not just an obligation, but it's also potentially a value adding set of information that enhances the value of that built asset.
So I've got about 64% people, so if anyone could vote quickly, then I'll publish the results. Any more coming in? Got a couple more coming in. So if everyone's happy now, I'll close that and publish that for you.
And interesting again to focus on this is primarily contractors, right, who are answering this question. Lots of room for improvement. Okay, I think that's a reasonable reflection. I would expect
it's a good kind of bell curve with obviously some people well advanced, we're ahead and want to be seen as digital leaders, but there's an equal number who are still heavily reliant on paper-based processes, and those in the middle making progress but looking to make improvements. So yeah, it's kind of where I'd expect the industry to be at this stage, but yeah, we've been on the digital transformation journey for a while, and there's no excuse now to be slowing down on that. In fact, from my point of view, digital transformation is an opportunity to create to differentiate businesses, for businesses to become more competitive and demonstrate their compliance in this process. In doing so, they'll be supporting various roles and responsibilities. The building safety regulatory regime at the moment provides for a number of duty holders that we need to support with information at various stages of project delivery and operation. So Richard, maybe it'd be helpful just to cover some of the responsibilities for information collection, storage, publication, and so forth.
Yeah, and I think this is really about the regulator now giving this bill teeth. I think it's so important that our buildings are safe and the occupiers of those buildings feel comfortable and safe within them. And I think they've built, they've tried to build some kind of teeth, some kind of give some strength, if you like. So in terms of the duty holders. Client asset owners, so they have a duty to ensure that the design and the contracting teams led by the principal contractor or the principal designer are competent and aware of the compliancy and building safety requirements. Designers and design teams, they have a responsibility to ensure that whatever they design, if it was built today, so if they have a digital design, let's imagine they built a ready for construction BIM model. If it was built today, would it be compliant with the building safety regulations? They have a responsibility to ensure effective communications with all other duty holders and to share and collaborate with the principal contractors. Principal contractors and subcontractors have a responsibility to manage, plan, monitor, and record building work. In relation to the specific aspects of components and materials and processes that have a bearing on safety. So it's some very well defined responsibilities, And there's also a certain level of enforcement as well. So, I know we want to spend a little bit of time talking about, potential solutions and the sort of the information handling aspects of this. But I think it's important just to cover off the, what is this bill all about and what does golden thread mean? And they've tried to, to develop, aspects of compliance. And, they've laid down some stop points which are quite significant. And this idea of gateways. So each party has to be capable of demonstrating compliance, and they've created a number of gateways as well through the process. Gateway 1 is at the planning stage. So they're trying to say, okay, look, you're going to deliver a building, you need to be thinking about safety right from concept, all right? So even at the planning stage, when there are actually no specific duty holders at this stage, fire statement need to be submitted at planning, and it requires a complete and detailed information in relation to the specific project. So even at the planning stage, we are talking about the very specifics of that particular building. So it's asking, it's no kind of standard kind of okay, use a document that covers fire safety. It's specifically about this building that you're going to deliver. Gateway 2 is just before construction begins, and they call this a hard stop point. So duty holders have been assigned, competence has been determined of those duty holders in terms of their ability to satisfy the requirement. Golden thread and reporting cadences have been approved by the regulator. Now, if this doesn't happen at this stage, there is a possibility that the project may be prevented from construction. So they're trying to to really focus on, you have to do this. These are not optional anymore, and neither should they be. And then the same at Gateway 3 at the completion stage, handover and validation of the golden thread information and supporting materials for use in operation. And are they complete? It's about almost a forensic analysis by the regulator of the information that's been accumulated during the construction phases, and are they satisfied that it provides all of the information necessary to ensure the safety of the building. So it's not a case. It's not just a case of, we want you to look at data and we want you to do this. They are going to enforce this, and they're going to police it, and they are going to monitor it. So
we've seen examples of this very recently in relation to provision, for example, of staircases in high-rise buildings. I know there was one significant building, high-rise residential building in central London, which was knocked back by planning officials because it only offered one escape staircase. It's a sign, really, that planners are now much more aware of safety considerations when it comes to giving approval to proposed buildings on their patches. So, Richard, in terms of the golden thread, I mentioned earlier the need for information to have longevity and be shareable. What other kind of principles do you think are important in respect of the golden thread?
Well, I think some of these have been discussed and are available in a number of reports, and they all have very similar themes and perspectives. It's about accuracy of the information and the ability to build trust around this information. So I think we're at the start of a process where the catalyst was an absolute tragedy, where lives were lost, and a huge degree of mistrust about am I safe living in this building? And I think we need to move over the years to a situation where everybody feels that the information is adequate enough to provide them with that level of confidence that they live in a safe building, and that any changes that are made to that building or retrofits, upgrades, are done in a way that doesn't compromise the integrity of the safety of that building. And that's going to need a huge amount of focus in terms of how we manage information as part of an execution process, whether it's building a new building or retrofitting it, or maybe substituting materials or components at some point in the future. At every stage, we need to ensure that the components, the installers, and the competency of the installers and the companies providing those services is adequate and meets the regulation. So it's all about trust, all right? There's also this conversation about making this information public facing, right? So, I think that's quite interesting as well, because, when we start to begin to move into this kind of world of information technology, this world that we've lived in for such a long time, Paul, very often this information is very local. It's private. It's really for the audience who are very focused on very often creating this information. But we need to think about how do we present this information to the public, all right? And these are things that we haven't had to think about before, and certainly asset owners haven't had to think about before. So there's some really interesting challenges here, and underlining all of that, I think, is also culture change. When I started in the construction space, almost 20 years ago, it was clear to me that introducing anything new always faced a certain degree of resistance. And it takes a while to change people's habits and to change the way that people think about how they perform their job. And I think, when I look at the bill and the research around the bill, I think they've recognized this in some ways, which is why they've put so much compliance and enforcement into place as well. So it's not an option. It's not an option anymore, guys. Right? You really have to do this. They talk about single source of the truth. A strap line that's been associated with common data environments for a very long time. But we're talking about a single source of the truth, which essentially connects together a lot of different information systems, right? So if you think about the architect designs a specific aspect of the building and provides that detail to the contractor, and it may be the specification of fire doors, right? Let's take something really simple: the specification of a fire door, the materials that they're going to use, and so on. It's handed over to the contractor. The contractor then has to go through a procurement process and ensure that the specification is met, and that the manufacturer and supplier can not only meet that specification, but can evidence their competency in terms of manufacturing to that specification. So it changes things. It's in some ways, Golden Thread even begins to touch into the procurement process, right? Because you're not just asking a supplier to give you a component, you're asking the supplier to give you a component plus a load of data, preferably data that can be read digitally, so not a PDF document or a brochure, as well as a lot of competency information about their ability to fulfill on those promises that they're providing to you. Accountability, understandable, things need to be understandable and consistent, simple to access. And of course, there's going to be a huge amount of interoperability here. There isn't any one point solution today that really satisfies the requirements of Golden Thread. And that's because it's essentially a process and a paradigm that requires us to think about every point of interaction with the supply chain and with materials and components and specifications and execution and handover, right? So, platform technologies can play a massive part in this in terms of being able to aggregate together and consolidate together data from different independent software systems and present something that's more relevant in terms of that consolidated information. So I think at this point, we've spoken a lot about sort of the technology as well as the culture, and I think that leads to our next poll question, which I think would be quite interesting to ask the audience. So Golden Thread, it speaks a lot about data and it speaks a lot about process. And I'm interested, we're very interested in terms of within your business, what do you think is easier to change? Is it easier to change technology, swap out a system, replace a manual accounting system for a digital accounting system, or whatever it happens to be? Or do you think it's easier to change culture, people, and old habits? So, if you were looking at those two domains, what's the easiest change?
They are challenging areas. We live in an industry where margins are thin, and in many cases, IT, certainly in the early days, was seen as an overhead. upon which expenditure needed to be carefully managed. We're also an industry which builds facilities upon which people's lives depend. So we're necessarily going to be quite conservative and risk averse. But there's a dividing line between being too conservative and risk averse, and then being or being prone to inertia. Not changing simply because you don't see the point in changing. If we've always done it this way, why do we need to change? And I think that's the attitude which is now being challenged by the building safety overhaul that we're seeing in the UK at the moment. There is a need to change. Complacency crept in, hence we've had disasters. We need to be shifting forward and creating better quality built assets that provide a better whole life service to those people they're expected, who are expected to live or work in those facilities.
So
how are we doing on the results?
Yeah, we've got about 70%. So if anyone wants to quickly vote before we close it, see if we can get a couple more in, and I'll close that now and publish that for you.
Yeah, I would agree. 100%.
It's an 80-20 direct split, so yeah, quite Absolutely. A good one. Yeah, I mean, I going back to my early days in the construction collaboration field, I remember one speaker, Tim Broyd, talking about successful collaboration. Yeah. And saying successful collaboration is 80% people and process, and only 20% technology. And he said, actually, the 20% is probably overdoing it. He said it's probably 90% people and process, and only 10% technology. And yet we sometimes see technology as the simple thing to do. We can buy new software, we can buy new mobile devices and apps and work in that way. But that doesn't necessarily bring about the change unless you have the change management regime in place to bring in new processes, enforce those processes, and get people wedded to those new ways of working.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, what gives me some hope is the wrong word, I guess. when I started in the industry 20 years ago, culture was highlighted as being, this is the issue. And there's a lot of people who would say, why have I got to do this using a piece of digital technology? What's wrong with my pen and paper? And there was a lot of, people didn't realize that it was going to give them a benefit until they realized that actually, oh, hang on, this is making my day better. All right. So I think it's interesting, but 20 years on from that starting point, into that start of that conversation in terms of culture, I think we have, we're beginning to see a sort of new generation of managers entering into the space. A lot more digital natives are now taking up positions. Who know nothing else other than digital, right? They and they don't accept anything other than information when I need it, how I need it, in my pocket, wherever I happen to be. So, hopefully that's going to help. But I think, what I would say from that poll is organizations need to start to sort of spread that word. We're going to be thinking about how do we execute on all of this? How do we consolidate and manage this information? But let's start spreading the word, amongst your people, having these conversations about why we are doing this and why it's so important. And off the back of the golden thread and other digital initiatives that are coming through. So that's an interesting statistic that we have there. Thank you everybody for voting.
Yeah, I think one anecdote that I would share was from one of the early days of Field View being deployed on a contractor's site out in the West Country, out near Bristol. I visited the site, and there was a chap there who, by his own admission, hated digital technology. He was wedded to his black book and his pencil that he carried around on site, but he loved being out on site. When he was given a tablet device, he initially said, well, why should I do this? I'm quite happy to continue working the way I've done, recording notes, going back to the site office, and then issuing notices, updating records and so on. But once he realized that the 5 minutes that he spent walking back to the office, and then the 5 minutes walking back to the site, was taking time out of his day, as was sitting at a laptop,
Exactly.
re-keying information.
Very
He began to
frustrating.
question. He suddenly realized there was an opportunity with the digital working. Plus, the digital device meant that he spent more time visible out on the construction site itself, and doing the task that he loved.
Exactly.
And he actually wore out 2 or 3 digital devices, simply because he filled them up with so much recorded information, so many photographs and so forth that was supporting the notifications that he sent out.
And I think we need to find, we need to get that right kind of blend, don't we, of motivations, because this isn't just about a lot more information to fill in because of this terrible tragedy and so on, and it took
it throws up opportunities to be capturing information which can be reused for performance improvements.
Exactly.
There's lots of side effects there, Richard. I'm sure you've got more examples you could draw on.
Yeah, and I think digitalization and data is 100% one of those, right? It's really interesting. There's a lot of material out there. There's a lot of people who talk about this, and and there's a lot of tier 1 contractors, who are saying that our stated ambition is to be a data-driven organization. And you don't get to be a data-driven organization unless you generate data, turn it into information, extract knowledge, and then use that knowledge to make wise decisions into the future, right? And I think Golden Thread is really just another perspective on this data-driven perspective, data-driven organization. So I think it's going to help with a lot of other things that are going on in terms of construction playbook, value procurement, and interoperability generally. There's also a big shift going on, right? I've always thought this from the moment I met the first MD of a construction company. I always thought, and it's always intrigued me, that construction is essentially a manufacturer, right? And I know there's a massive debate about, hey, no, it's not, because we build different things every time, and manufacturers build the same thing over and over again. But I think with the level of digitization, with the level of information management that we now have, I don't think that's an excuse anymore, right? And it's happening. So people talk about modern methods of manufacture, offsite manufacture. May specifically talk about this idea of construction to production, right? Inspired by manufacturing. Generally the view is that construction is at least 2 decades behind manufacturing. And earlier on, I talked about, Golden Thread is not a new concept to manufacturers, right, or to the automotive industry. So I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from that. And then we can have all of the other benefits. We can look at this data, can help us look at our industry from a perspective of sustainability and carbon reduction, collaboration, culture. There is just so many, valuable side effects with this digitalization. And I think a lot of synergy with BIM and digital twin as well. And I think so. It's not as if it's another new initiative. I think it's just another perspective on the same problem and the same challenge, which is effective management of data and information in a way that allows us to deliver upon the needs of the people who are looking at safety, or the people who are looking at quality, or the people who are looking at costs, or the people who are looking at sustainability, or the people who are looking at well-being, right? It all comes from good quality data and information and communication. That same person in construction, that first MD, he also said to me something else. He said, Richard, effective construction is about effective communication. I think you said that early on as well, Paul. And these are the things that are right at my heart,
Yeah, I mean, in the interests of effective communication, I think we should be getting our audience to think about any questions they might want to ask. We'll be coming to you very shortly to see if you have questions you want to ask. I wanted quickly just to pick up on the BIM and digital twin piece that you mentioned, Richard. Certainly, I can recall quite vividly the launch of the UK BIM process more than a decade ago now. We're talking I think it was 2011, the first big push, officially government sanctioned push for building information modelling started in the UK. We've had a decade of a push towards that. We've also now had, getting on for 5 years, of people discussing the digital twin. So this for those familiar with, perhaps not so familiar with the term, the digital twin envisages essentially a connected digital version of the built asset, so that the physical and the digital assets can be developed in parallel, and one used to gain insights from the other and to manage aspects of each other. So they are interconnected. There's a two-way interplay between them. And that really does play quite heavily into the need for the golden thread. This becomes a way in which we can evidence that the building continues to be maintained and operated in compliance with the vision that it's the asset owner, the designers and constructors and component suppliers had when it was originally built.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'd add, I think from my perspective, when you look at BIM and digital twin, because it's a hot topic, I see digital twin as essentially BIM with dynamics. All right, and I know this is very subjective, and you can talk about whether BIM is a static or dynamic kind of data system, information system, but for me, digital twin definitely adds dynamics. And it's not just about the sort of the attributes and qualities and specifications of the building, but it's about what is the movement, what is the energy consumption flow, what is the lighting levels, what is the heating levels, how many people are moving through these doors. It adds a level of dynamism that can only be delivered through IoT and real world sensors, right? So it starts to to bring this together. And just to finish, I think a good example is again to go back to automotive, right? In terms of what do automotive have today that we could look at that relates in some way to golden thread, digital twin, and BIM. If you think of your car vehicle, every part, every component in that vehicle is uniquely identified as a part number, has its attributes and so on. It's always consistent. All right. The supply chains within the automotive are entirely integrated. So they exchange information using EDIs, and they provide components and materials just in time. So they almost have 24-hour sort of turnarounds. Sustainability is improved because locality of the supply chain is important within manufacturing, because the closer you are to the manufacturing facility, the quicker you can get your parts there, right? So and that plays into sustainability and so on. There's a very specific bill of materials that go into the manufacturing process that say these materials come together at this point with these resources, and they assemble to create these production pieces. We have a bill of material in essence. I think BIM is almost a bill of material for building in some ways, right? And I know there could be some interesting conversations around that. But then when you look at sort of handover and operation, you drive around your vehicle, there's a degree of IoT and sensoring in your vehicle. So you have engine warning systems, tire pressure levels, all of these things are telling you what is the condition of this vehicle, all right? So you've got this kind of digital twin going on in some ways, perhaps, all right? Certainly if you look at Tesla, you definitely got a digital twin, because you have Elon Musk has got, and his team have got a blueprint of what's happening on the road. It's not just about sort of the vehicle, it's about what it's doing, right? And then of course, manufacturers in automotive, they can do product recalls, and they can be very specific, and they can say, this vehicle registered between these dates, sent to this particular region is going to be recalled because this specific part number is no longer compliant. Now, hopefully it doesn't take a huge sort of leap of imagination to sort of translate that into construction, right? And we need to replace a fire door. We need to replace the ironmongery on that fire door. We need to replace it with exactly the same specification that it was designed to support, not just the size and the shape and the materials, but the specification, and it needs to be, installed by somebody who's competent. So I think there's a lot of lessons.
One of the things I recall from, we're talking ahead of UK Construction Week coming up in a month's time. When I was at UK Construction Week last year, I recall there being applications that residents could potentially use in their apartments that were effectively the dashboard view of the energy performance and humidity, temperature, and other conditions that they had in their apartment. And these are being offered as kind of smart meters, but also they were being marketed as the digital twin of their apartment. So a kind of bit of marketing hype there, but also a sign of where the technology is going.
Exactly. And just to finish on that, just one second,
Nathan, we just need to have some questions. We need to have time for questions, I think.
So yeah, that final poll question, I got something I really wanted to say there. The final poll question for everybody out there, and this is an interesting question, I think. Is the built environment capable of operating like a manufacturer? I'd be really interested in your views on that. And then Paul, just as the audience is filling in that, we talk often, don't we, about the acceleration in technology, the idea that we now have technologies that allow us to have reality capture, point cloud acquisition, drones, and how do we sort of merge all of this different information, all of this data into one place and use it, for the purpose of safety, or for the purpose of quality, or for the purpose of sustainability, or for the purpose of whatever the observer is trying to sort of solve or untangle. And it's clear that technology is ready. AI, machine learning, reality capture, platform solutions, aggregation, business intelligence, deep data analytics, all of this stuff is available as tools to the industry now. And I think with this new generation of digital natives as well, it's going to.
And we can benefit from other industries having paved the way. We can learn lessons from the successful applications so that it doesn't take as long for it to be implemented in the built environment. So Nathan, what the responses on this one like?
Brilliant. I'm just gonna. There's about 60% votes in, so I'll close it in a second. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So I'll share that with you.
That's encouraging. That's encouraging. I think if we'd asked that 20 years ago, it would have been the other way around. That's very encouraging. I take a lot of comfort from that in terms of the direction our industry is going in.
Yeah, I think it's an endorsement of some of the things like modern methods of construction, design for manufacture and assembly, the platform-based approach to construction, deeper integration with manufacturers and construction product suppliers into the process. But Nathan, what about some questions?
We do have quite a few questions, so thank you for that. I think it was a really interesting conversation and good to have people's feedback. The first one came in quite early, and I think it kind of touches on, Richard, what you were just talking about, relating to perhaps the car dashboard and Tesla and so on. But Brett Ford asked about whole life, and is it not an issue when current standards and requirements can change in a few years or less? I mean, they change all the time. So how do you enable whole life compliance and improve the detail when things can become outdated so quickly? And also, I guess, to do with, he said, probably due to asset insurance requirements. How do you cope with that?
That's a really interesting question. I think we can't predict the future in terms of how things will change in terms of the demands on the industry and the requirements and the focus and the legislation. But what we can do is ensure that we have the necessary processes that allow us to, accumulate data and connect that data in a way that gives us enough information to be able to react to changing circumstances as we move forward. I think that's the best answer I can give to that at the moment. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of changing requirements for buildings, you only have to look at the retrofit sector and how that has grown. We have a legacy of many millions of buildings that were constructed in the early part of not just the last century, but the century before that, back into the 1800s. And the occupants of many of those buildings are now retrofitting with insulation, heat pumps, all of those things, simply just to meet the new obligations that there are, new drivers from climate change and so on. So yes, there will be changes like that. And certainly, I think the questioner also mentioned insurance. As insurers put obligations on both occupants and residents and building owners, that's going to be a strong driver for change, particularly also because people will be looking at the opportunities that come from, lower premiums if their buildings are compliant and on spec.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that's great. And hopefully, we've got a new government retrofit. We're all hoping, aren't we, comes back on the agenda in a bigger way. So, Sophie, I'm going to come to Sophie now. I'm going to turn her, see if she can speak to us. Try to turn her microphone on. Sophie, you there?
I'm here, yes. Hello, this is Sophie Peachy from Myotics.
Hi, Sophie. It's great to hear from you.
Hi, Richard. My question is, if a through-life digital twin is part of the solution, then are contractors ready to hand over a digital asset alongside the physical asset for the new asset owner to manage with its supply chain going forward? Or do you see a shortage in digital skills to make this happen?
I'll jump in quickly.
Yeah,
and
go ahead.
I'll say at the moment, no, they're not in a position to be able to deliver that operational digital twin. That's just a not yet. I think that we are some years away from being able to provide a fully connected digital twin capability, but we are building the rudiments of people's ability to do so. Common data environments have been mentioned a few times. We are capturing an increasing amount of digital information during the design, construction, handover and commissioning processes. And we have some sophisticated client organizations who are able to import that information for asset operation and use throughout the asset's life cycle. But that's the thin end of a very wide-based pyramid at the moment.
Yeah, I guess I would tend to agree with Paul, although I think the need to be able to do it and the pressures to be able to deliver functional digital twins are higher now than they ever have been. If you think about the existing energy crisis, right? Which and the sustainable agenda. There is so much value that can be delivered on an operational basis. This whole idea of sort of continual digital commissioning. That required very specific and accurate digital twin information and a lot of sensor information feeding back how this building is operating. The prize is so big in terms of sustainability and costs that whilst we may not be able to do it now, I think we're gonna get there very close. And there's a lot of really big organizations who are committed to making this happen, and I feel as if we are on that tipping point. And I think within the next sort of 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot more, real digital twins in operation, delivering real value to a lot, and providing solutions to big global questions. That's my hope. I'm an optimist, but that's my hope.
Brilliant. Okay, I hope that answers Sophie. And yeah, we've got a couple of, I know we're up to the hour, but I'm just going to try and get through a couple more if we can, if you guys are all right for time. Yeah, that's good. Okay. I guess, in terms of, I noticed there's a few manufacturers on here actually who perhaps they weren't one of the categories at the beginning. So I've actually had a couple of people mention this, but how can basically a product manufacturer best supply our information in a digital format that feeds into the central platform? That one was from Richard McMullen.
Paul, I can go. I can have a go at that. Provide digital information is clearly important, but I think there's, because if you think about what traditionally happened, right? I guess specifications were delivered as PDF documents. Sometimes those PDF documents were actually digital. Sometimes they were just, essentially images. The ability to read that information off was poor. So, the question is absolutely correct, right? We need to be able to provide accurate and meaningful digital information about specific attributes and specifications of the components. I think standards are going to play a huge part in this. Because again, my understanding is that sometimes, even specification and attributes of components are described in different ways. So some may use sort of pounds per square inch, and some may use bar or other kind of measures and metrics for defining their products. In terms of the very specific question of how do we go about doing it, I don't have a specific answer to that in terms of go use this product, go use that product. But I would say, just start managing the attributes and specifications of your products in a digital form. Think about the naming conventions that you use. Think about whether they align with what the industry is asking for. And there will be technology providers, and the industry will come up with the mechanics that allow you to share this information.
I think it's already happening, Richard. If you look at, we have an increasingly sophisticated classification system, Uniclass 2015, which is being expanded to incorporate a wider and wider range of components and systems. And we've also had, in the last couple of years, both a code for construction product information, now being managed, was originated in the Construction Products Association. And there's also was a parallel initiative within the Institution of Engineering and Technology, the IET, to do a plain language guide to construction product information. So those are resources that people can find online. I know Sue Butcher, a friend of mine, was heavily involved in developing that plain language guide. So there are resources out there, and certainly the plain language guide talks about, as Richard described, the use of structured data, capturing that information, making that information shareable in a way that means it's easily incorporated into other technologies and other information requirements from members of the supply chain and the asset owner operator.
But it's really encouraging, Nathan, that we have in this level of dialogue and discourse with manufacturers. I think the nature of the audience that we have here and the kinds of questions that we've been asked is really very, very encouraging, I think, for our industry.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got a good mixture of people on here. I think there were probably maybe 10-15% of the audience maybe manufacturers, and there wasn't one of the choices. So yeah, and obviously, I mean, that kind of probably gives us, there are other questions, but I think what we'll do is we'll send those over to you so you can come back to people individually. Probably gives us a good opportunity to wind up and say, obviously you guys are both going to be at UK Construction Week from the 4th to the 6th of October. I know Archdesk have a stand there as well, so perhaps people could come and have a conversation with you there. I believe you've got some talk sessions as well on this. And also, I know you mentioned Sue Butcher there, Paul. She will be at the event talking about the plain language guide, and the CPA are also there talking about the CCPI. So we're covering a lot of that in the show, so hopefully we can keep this conversation going. So yeah, so thank you very much to both of you. And just to mention as well that if you want to learn a bit more about Archdesk or contact, we can connect you with Richard afterwards, but I think you can go to archdesk.com to find out more information there as well. But obviously we want to see you all in October. But yeah,
fantastic. Yeah, so I'd just like to say thank you for everybody for tuning in. It's been really interesting conversation, and it's been really interesting to have those questions. And I've got one request actually. I'd be really interested in talking to the organisations that answered the question about digitalisation in terms of we're ahead of the game. Not because I'm really curious in terms of how have they gotten there, right? Well, what does that mean? What does that organisation look like? And I'd be really fascinating. So if the people who answered we're ahead of the game were able to get in touch, just to have a chat, it would be fantastic. I'd love to hear from them.
Fantastic. No, that's a great idea, and we look forward to hearing what they've got to say. So thank you very much, Richard. Thanks very much, Paul. And
thank you, everybody.
Yeah, we'll see you in October.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye,
everybody.